Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. And welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. And this is Episode 42, A Deeper Look at the Stuart Rule. How many paths must a man walk down? And today on the podcast, we have a returning guest, Joseph Ardennes. He was one of our most popular guests in the past. He was last here on the Jethro Tull episode, the dreaded agricultural revolution and engineering. We talked a lot about the growing industries in the early modern period, how industry and trade was the source of Dutch wealth that made them the richest people in Europe and the world. And the English were coming on strong, catching up in many areas of technology, and with leading positions in lead, light woolen clothing, the new draperies, alum, and stocking knitting. And you wouldn't think this was a great basis for the miracle, and yet it was not, except for coal and a metallurgical industry poised for takeoff. But growing industries with more people able to work and...
Now hold on. I thought rural underemployment was still the great curse of the time. I mean, it meant starvation and freezing to death. And as of right now, you're still in the 17th century, and this problem would persist until the early 19th century.
It surely was. And rural poverty was the great curse of all times before this as well. This is not new. The form of it changed after the Black Death, and people's lives became more self-directed than under serfdom. But rural poverty was not defeated by that move until the Malthusian limits could be broken, as it had for the Dutch. And now, the more could work in industry, and for them there were some comforts of life available. And life in many of the towns was also improving considerably. The rise of the new industries and growing internal trade was behind this alleviation of poverty and misery.
Alleviation for some, sure, but not outright elimination.
So the Stuart kings, with the well-being of their kingdom deeply at heart, were very supportive of the new industries and continued the Elizabethan policies of encouraging economic growth and alleviating poverty. No, they did not. I'm very sorry to say.
Hold on. What?
They didn't have a way to think about the problem or motivation. They liked things the way they were, resisted changes. The Stuarts and their court were something between indifferent and hostile to industrial advances. Archbishop Laud hated profiteering and blamed man rather than God for famines, but he was also a key figure against enclosures, which would increase food yields. Their core concern was money, and they weren't big thinkers. Contrast the early Stuart kings with Louis XIV and his advisors, who kept deliberately trying to strengthen their kingdom. They were against enclosures because it reduced the number of taxpayers and tithe payers. They feared unemployment, but paradoxically took many, many actions that increased unemployment. Their economic ideas were incoherent and also quite far down their list of concerns. Their interference in the economy was heavy-handed at times. I can only think of one action that was any good for the poor, and that was to order JPs to buy up grain when there were shortages and sell it at below market prices. I mean, this was good short-term, long-term, not. The Little Ice Age is starting, and we are not ready. Generally, they operated at 20th century Latin American dictator levels of sophistication. They claimed royalties from all extractive industries and sold monopolies on all new industrial processes they knew about. They forbade employers from laying off workers after overproduction. They suppressed middlemen wherever possible. I covered 6 early modern economic fallacies in episodes 36 and 37, but there were many more. I've mentioned that monopolies were generally allowed to companies. Crown support for monopoly companies in Shrewsbury and Cheshire were rewarded with support during the Civil War, but generally this would work against them. I've also said that monopolies were allowed to corporations, and I should clarify that the term corporation really means a city or town in the early modern context. Cities/towns had charters and were run by corporations. The City of London was a corporation, for example. And I've tried to shy away from using the word corporation this way because I thought it would be confusing to modern ears, but I'm telling you now because I feel I may slip in that usage coming up. Progress occurred all over, hidden from view of the crown. The successful metallurgical industries in Birmingham, they were never organized in guilds. Therefore, people could start businesses without serving a 7-year apprenticeship. Around Birmingham, we see what will become a world leader grow up almost the only place that was free from these regulations. A happy accident? No. That might be a lesson to regulators of occupations today. You never see the hidden cost of requiring licensing, certifications, and educational requirements. But any region free of those customary rules might have had the prosperity which brought tens of thousands out of poverty. It was there for the taking, except that everyone was self-sabotaging with archaic laws and regulations. So that's it. People are still committing fallacy 5. Humans cannot help it really. But you should keep Birmingham in mind. And during the Civil War, this region produced weapons and volunteers for Parliament only.
If the Stuarts are doing so badly with the economy, aren't there some feedback loops that help them course correct? Surely the House of Stuarts is too big to fail.
Yeah, that's a hard thing for us to understand, but there really were none except for customs revenue, and that only had to do with foreign trade. There were not otherwise any systemic indicators. It would not occur to anyone that there could be. People did keep track of the prices of commodities like wheat, but didn't think systematically about what that meant. And the government seemed indifferent to the concept of economic improvement, unlike during Elizabeth's time, when the idealistic Commonwealth men had a great deal of influence. The notion of improvement was gaining ground outside the court, as covered in Planck's book on improvement. It was becoming an ideology, and would be coming into power during and after the Civil War. They would begin the process of gathering economic statistics and beginning economic prescriptions. Most successes seemed to happen out of sight of the crown. We discussed with Leisure Larry that the new draperies industries flourished and also became a world leader. It was these world leaders that concern us. I mean, it's very interesting to see them 100 plus years before what we normally call the Industrial Revolution. The new draperies are lighter cloths than the old staple thick woolens. The traditional or thicker woolen cloth, I should say something about. I mean, it could have been improved if the old rules had been thrown out and made more flexible. It was an old industry, heavily regulated since medieval times, and began to lose to foreign competition. The thick woolen broadcloth, hard-wearing, a good coat could last decades, so the market was there as long as foreigners could afford to buy and nobody else was making a better product. A little personal anecdote. There's one of those broadcloth coats in my family that's 50 years old minimum. It's an old-style naval pea coat, possibly originally military issue. My father bought it used from a thrift store in Redwood City in the 70s. For people outside the U.S., a thrift store sells donated things. You give things to a thrift store like Goodwill, and they sell it and use the revenue for charitable purposes. So who knows how old it was then? He had it a couple decades. Then I started wearing it in my 20s because it looked so damn good. It was about the only clothing item I had that was ever praised by women when I was in college. Then, after a couple decades, my daughters started to wear it. Now I have it again. I mean, seriously, these are hard-wearing, long-lasting cloths. And they look fabulous. Ideal clothing for Europe during a time when even the Bosporus froze over as it did in 1621. But the lighter new draperies had the virtue of being cheaper and suitable for the domestic poor in England as well as France and the Mediterranean. And so with that bigger market, now there are a lot of poor people. The new draperies were on their way.
Okay, so this is like your Birmingham metallurgy example. The new draperies grew because they were unregulated, and the broadcloth industry had great potential. That example of your 50-year-old coat is pretty amazing. Did you only have $20 in your pocket when you bought it? But the broadcloth industry was tightly regulated, so a side benefit was consistently high quality.
Yes, that's true. Quality was good, but it took most of the century for the English to capture the higher value parts of the process. Most of the wool was raw or partially finished, with the higher value finishing being done in the United Provinces. But more and more of the higher value-added parts of the production, like dyeing, was done in England as the century went on.
You seem to be arguing that if the regulations were lighter, or perhaps modernized, even the broadcloth industry could have been more successful.
Of course. I mean, no what-if scenario is ever certain, but Restricting the labor force, especially the vital, skilled labor force, could only have an unhealthy effect. And the flip side of a single product of high standard quality is no innovative products that the market might have preferred. Within London, monopoly companies were in fierce competition with small masters in a large variety of trades and industries. The conservative Stuart governments, in theory, supported the small producers for the same reason they opposed enclosures: more tithe payers and taxpayers. But their need for immediate cash always caused them to lean towards the big companies. London craftsmen offered the royalist side approximately zero support during the Civil War. Now, Stuart economic regulations could never succeed because they did not invent a bureaucracy the way that France and Spain did, as we discussed in episode 33. And I'll just mention again, fallacy 5, that in dynamic periods, ideas about regulation are incoherent, means that the English were accidentally better off because their regulations were poorly enforced and had giant holes. To enforce regulations, they accidentally created a group of professional informers who were much hated and easily bribable anyway. Another contributor to the farce theme of episode 41. They mainly relied on unpaid JPs to enforce their regulations. Men who were often the employers, the regulations were directed against. The attempts to prosecute dairy distributors in London as middlemen almost made the city impossible to feed. As I said, the sophistication was lacking as they fell victim to fallacy 3 against middlemen. A predictable consequence was regulations hitting the new draperies. Predictable as mold growing on cheese. They started requiring stamps of approval, which were supposed to guarantee quality, but really were a way for the Duke of Lennox, the monopolist, to collect taxes on the new draperies with a small cut to the crown. After a few years, they figured the whole process of inspection was inefficient, and they just started selling the stamps by the bushel load. Though, this was a thing said by the enemies of monopoly, so maybe polemics of the time.
You sure bring up polemics a lot.
Well, it's an age-old problem for history. When you read an original source, you have to wonder if they're telling the truth. You have to wonder if they were even trying to tell the truth. Sometimes, like when a king is involved, the only safe thing to write is something positive. So it's tempting to think, oh, everybody's supportive of the king. But it might be that unsupportive things were just not written down. The lack of free speech is a huge problem for history.
I could believe that. It's an asymmetric information problem. In order to get certainty, you have to wait for some fact that can't be spun or distorted.
Or look closely where we think there's no reason to hide the truth. I mean, you've probably heard the expression that at the time of the Civil War, the House of Commons could buy the House of Lords 3 times over. That's an expression they used back then. And certainly when we look at how landholdings changed, we do see those changes occurring. And we can be confident about what happened, but not so much about how. At the time, this was often explained as a story of virtue winning out. And it may be, let's get back to that. Contemporaries explain it, and even brilliant 20th century historians like Christopher Hill explain it in a way that we might see as a morality play. The safest way to prosperity lay in careful attention to small gains and losses, bookkeeping, watching markets, and avoiding unnecessary extravagance. As Adam Smith put it, I'll try my Adam Smith voice. To improve land with profit, like all other commercial projects, requires an exact attention to small savings and small gains, of which a man born to a great fortune, even though naturally frugal, is very seldom capable. The situation of such a person disposes him to attend to ornament than to profit. And I'll try it normal voice. Quote, to improve land with profit, like all other commercial projects, requires an exact attention to small savings and small gains, of which a man born to a great fortune, even though naturally frugal, is very seldom capable. The situation of such a person naturally disposes him to attend to ornament than to profit. Unquote. And these home virtues were exactly those cultivated and idealized by Puritans. The doctrine of calling meant taking your work seriously. You even see Neil Stevenson make this point in the Baroque cycle. Anglicans and Puritans, and you and I can understand this morality play, but nobles might easily be blind to it. And yet it was not the complete picture. While all Adam Smith just said might be true, the other factor was the desire for land by non-nobles for the purposes of prestige and status. Someone who made their money elsewhere by developing blast furnaces or more likely engaging in trading or even piracy would secure a future for themselves and their families by buying land. There was no alternative, as we shall see. There were no safe government bonds. Stocks and companies were super risky, far more than today. Banks? What's a bank? That Dutch thing? Cold, hard cash, gold bars were vulnerable to theft. And people did have many hundreds of thousands of pounds of gold on deposit with the goldsmiths. Sometimes this was even stored in the Tower of London. But sometimes kings, short on cash as they often were, simply seized what they needed. So land was not only the best way to secure status and prestige, it was also the best way to preserve wealth. So add that to your morality play. And wealth was mainly accumulated through commercial activity and industry rather than farming. But land was the place where your profits could go to a comfortable, reasonably safe rest in a peaceful countryside, and England was peaceful compared to much of Europe. You could enjoy your property quietly, and the right to quiet enjoyment of property became a core legal right over time. And your property did not need to be wasted on guards and fighting men to protect what you had. It also meant that there were people with cash to spare for industrial projects. And while many old noble families fell into genteel poverty, some actually did very well in agriculture, so the morality play is not so neat.
Hold the late 19th century candlestick phone. You are against social construction of reality in the Birth of Sciences episode. But you're accepting it here, with the talk of morality play.
Some of it's unavoidable in history. I said in episode 38 that the weak form of the argument is fine by me, and I even used it in the Magna Carta and the Creation of Parliament episodes for the agreed social delusion involved in each. It's fine to state them now and again, but they get boring to keep discussing. The best analysis we have, which is imperfect, suggests that freeholders and farmers with long-term leases, what people will call yeomen, were only about 5.5% of the population. Most farmers were on shorter-term leases called copyhold leases. These were a very large but vulnerable group, even though these people actually had really great rights in common law, but had difficulty enforcing their rights. A bad landlord might arbitrarily raise customary fees to the child when the farmer died. A customary fee is the amount you would pay to inherit your father's lease, and if they did not have funds to fight it out in court, they would lose their land. By the way, you can see how very weak and tenuous property rights were at the time. Tradition is more powerful still. Okay, back to copyholders. And these are the same people liable to be affected by enclosures, as we talked about. They would lose parts of their land, and they would certainly lose rights to common land that were absolutely necessary to their comfortable survival. And when these people had to rely on wages earned in a rural economy with only seasonal work, there was often desperate poverty, hunger, and often death by cold. As we mentioned, cold being the great killer for those who could not afford fuel for their fires. And the way out for these people would be industrial labor, and the relative success of industrial labor is why there would be that incredible population boom that went along with the miracle. We talked about enclosures a lot in episode 20, and I mentioned that the king was against them during the long period of personal rule while Parliament was for them. During just 3 years, 1636 to 1638, 600 persons were fined for illegally enclosing land, and huge numbers of the Long Parliament that summoned in 1641 suffered under this royal policy. From the Midland counties, we know that half the members were from families that had been fined, another way for the king to be unpopular with the landowners. And now we covered that enclosures were just necessary to increase arable land to feed a growing, doubling population, recall. But why? There were vast amounts of royal forest land. Much had been cleared and encroached on over the years. The king was far away, after all. But when Charles was desperate for money, Out came royal agents to find people all over the place for real and imagined encroachment on royal forests. Another way for the king to become unjust, to fail at his metaphysical role. Enclosures. The government's resisting enclosures, so we might think the crown is popular with the poor for resisting enclosure. But it didn't get credit. Someone local always had to act for the crown to get involved. We can see Oliver Cromwell getting his true legitimacy with the people as Lord of the Fens by resisting enclosures in the Fens, fighting for the people in local terms. The people actually knew him and what he was doing to save their common land and save their fens from drainage. And the crown actually alienated the poor with their defense of royal forest land. Lots of those people we talked about that roamed the landscape on the point of starvation actually settled in royal forest land under Elizabeth, where there was good land for like raising pigs and little clearings that made for growing food on small plots. Well, the Stuarts, mainly Charles, cracked down, displaced families, tried to extract fines, and they created bitter enemies this way. And the other thing is unsexy. It is coal. When I say coal, your ears should perk up. Coal is something you could build a miracle on. Coal went from around 200,000 tons a year when Henry died to 1.5 million in 1640. So that's a 7 times increase, almost all transported by water. Correct your maps. Newcastle is the new Peru, someone said it at the time. Peru being the main source of Spanish silver. But coal was more than just a source of heat for London homes, which it was for sure, but the easy availability of energy supported the iron industry, which I mentioned was quintupling and would shortly quintuple again. And remember your physics. Easy energy supported steel making, paper making, soap boiling, glass making, dyeing, salt making, brewing. All kinds of furnace-based or simple boiling-based industry could switch to coal power. Okay, listen to this. England produced 3 times as much coal as the rest of Europe put together. 3 times as much. And lots of historians would point to this fact, this raw and brutal fact, and say rude things to me like, "There's your miracle right there, black and dense with energy. Stop wasting your time on a podcast." But that's obviously wrong and hurtful. Podcasters have feelings too, you know. It's not because Britain had more coal in the ground. They did not. But because they were using it more in industry. Because well before what we call the miracle, they were pulling ahead. And as we talked about the constitutional changes and civil war, this might not matter a lot. And when we talk about the great struggles against the Dutch, it matters a lot. And when we talk about the great struggle against France, the bigger, richer country, this will matter a great deal. When we talk about the great struggles against the Dutch, pretty soon it matters a lot. Capitalism is just getting started in small ways. How did it start? Merchants are buying lead and copper and iron from miners in advance and loaning money to pin makers and pot makers so that they can produce their goods, which the merchants would buy and then sell. A whole causal chain of human activity from digging ore out of the ground to the consumer buying pots and pans was enabled and encouraged by a few far-seeing merchants. But a lot of the old industries were not organized on a capitalist basis, like the old wool cloth trade, which for centuries was the primary export industry. The newer, far more flexible capitalist basis would outcompete everyone. Because why? You should know this, all you Doctor Who fans. Time. Time. Time is not such a great enemy when you switch to capitalist organization. Trust is required because credit is at its base. Trust among and across the godly was easier to establish before credit scores and Amazon rankings. And with credit, everyone can work and buy and sell without having ready cash first. Time, we vanquish you. You need wool to make your stockings. Well, here, pay me back next month when you sell your stock. That's the real basis of capitalist organization. It's what I'm talking about. I mean, capitalism is a weird word One of those words, what Marvin Minsky calls a suitcase word, that everybody packs their own jumbled up meanings in it, and it means something different to everyone. But what do we say on the podcast?
Words cannot be treated like symbols in an equation. Here you have someone involved in the process, the merchant you said, extending the credit necessary for the flow from producer to consumer to function. And that's the key improvement over feudal-type organization with guilds, officials, and agents in addition to merchants.
And medieval regulation. Some point to labor flexibility, allowing people to work in any field they choose as equally important. The guilds and government involvement add nothing but subtraction to production and distribution at this time. Later, however, under the Republic and Cromwell, the Navy will begin offering protection against pirates, and ambassadors will insist on rights of Englishmen being observed abroad. And that will be very helpful indeed. There will be agents to buy captured sailors out of slavery, for example. But before the Civil War, within the Stuart way of doing things, England was overpopulated. And overpopulation is a sad thing. Hungry people, people maintained by the parish with very little to be proud of. Some of these would learn to read and spread very radical ideas born of desperation. And fair enough, the poor might be treated as well as possible locally, but they were not treated as if they had rights in the face of national concerns. Impressment in the Navy, recruitment for colonies, many hundreds were picked off the streets to be shipped to Virginia and the Caribbean. Miners received rights to conscript the poor, as we've mentioned. And these armies that are going to fight and die for the Stuarts in episode 43, this is where they get them. One element to emphasize was that poor relief was essentially voluntary. Huge sums were given, more than were paid in taxes to the crown. Yes, more by a lot. But if taxes were proposed, they were resisted strongly. And you can see why, right? When it's voluntary and you are deeply involved personally, you know you are doing good. You are winning Pascal's wager. It feels good in this life. But everyone around you can see that you're winning in the afterlife also. And this is vitally important. Talk about status. Talk about Adam Smith's insight that we want to be lovely. But when it is a tax, you just imagine some courtiers spending the money on gold thread for their second best coat. When it comes to the poor, we have social radicals like the levelers making all kinds of charges and accusations against any and all in society. But they never ever said the poor were better off under the time of personal rule by Charles. The long tradition of ordinary people having the longbow surely had some influence on how well the poor were treated in England. And possibly this is enough to account for their better treatment in the 14th and 15th centuries compared to the continent. And all my build-up about a more just society just might be hot air. But longbow training stopped. Firearms replaced them, and a strict gun control regime limited access to firearms to the upper classes. And maybe this is enough to explain increasing oppression of the poor. Possibly, we have to wait for sanity to be possible about gun control to get solid objective studies about this. But in Stuart England, naked force underlay social relations as only the landed class had the best weapons.
Pascal's wager would still be operative, though.
There was an undercurrent of fear of the many-headed monster. There were still occasional peasant revolts, but now the gentry advantage in armament was dramatically better now that the peasants did not have the longbow. The Midlands Revolt in 1607 was one of the larger ones, mainly against the practice of enclosure. In 1622, Gloucestershire, a large group of the poor went to the houses of the rich, seizing goods and demanding money. And there was the Western Rising in 1626 with half a dozen revolts in several districts spread out over 6 years. 1631 saw the Reverend Peter Simon preaching the equality of man in the Forest of Dean. Was Harry Potter hiding there? The equality of man? What an idea! Didn't that sort of preaching kick off the utterly brutal peasants' revolt in Germany in the 1520s? Why, yes, it did. Do we want that here? Why, no, we do not. Not at all. We covered this in episode 23, by the way. Fear that the poor would be seduced into social and political heresy was one of the factors in what will look like a weirdly bigoted, narrow-minded Presbyterian Anglican response to religious toleration in the 1640s. So when we encounter people of Cromwell's inclination that conscience is supreme, There should be no religious punishment. People can think and practice how they like. Well, that was associated in many gentry minds with the revolting peasantry. So this will help explain the intensity of the conflict between socially conservative Presbyterians and independents of Cromwell's type in the coming decades. Because if you think about it as just freedom of conscience, that doesn't explain the intensity. The difference is in this fear, this cold fear of revolt from below. And during the Civil War, many on the parliamentary side and on the king's side felt that fear of the many-headed monster would bring the other side to a compromise. But with both sides expecting the other to compromise, it didn't work. In any case, this is another one of those examples of inferential distance. It's a really, really difficult factor for us to keep in mind. No one really wanted the Civil War, but both sides felt they could win in a game of chicken. But we've been talking about the incredible strength of the Puritans since episode 34. Well, they pioneered almshouses, education for the poor, credit for apprenticeships, and many more efforts to help the poor and alleviate poverty. The radicals were going to be Puritan flavored because they were essentially Puritan products. And I don't want to deny their agency and their own intellectual journeys, but they would be Puritans, or let's say Puritan adjacent. Although a few like the Ranters would go pretty far in the libertine direction. It's like today there's really a small group of rationalists, but large numbers of intelligent people are interested in Slate Star Codex, Less Wrong, Robin Hanson, and friendly, as opposed to unfriendly, artificial intelligence. These are rationalist adjacent people who agree with rationalists intellectually, just not their tendencies to live in group houses and have uncommon social and sexual practices. Of all the economic and social ways the crown lost the people, monopolies were the most hated. They were not totally always wrong to have. I mean, they created a successful brass industry for cannon making and also a successful gunpowder industry. The monopolies made very large investments safe, so perhaps they were necessary. But in other areas, they went badly. Usually, only people connected to court could get monopolies, so they created social division within the upper classes. Or if you wanted to form a company to exploit some new technology like we talked about with pin makers, they had to bribe someone at court. And this is another topic where inferential distance is a problem for us today. Let me try to explain the scale of the monopoly problem with Christopher Hill's humble house example. You live in a brick house built with monopoly bricks, looked out of windows of monopoly glass. Monopolies controlled the interior paint, the coal you burned on the iron that made the grate, the tapestries you hung, the feathers you slept on, the brushes and combs you used. You washed with monopoly soap, ironed with monopoly starch, the lace, the leather, linen, and thread you wore were all monopolies. So were your belts, buttons, and pins, dice, cards, pens, paper, spectacles, and books, even the Bible. You ate monopoly currants, butter, salmon, herring, and lobsters. Some of you are probably thinking you'd skip the herring anyway. You want seasoning, salt, pepper, vinegar, all monopolies. Thirsty, hops, beer, wine, your mugs, bottles, all monopolies. Okay, I'll stop here. And this is about halfway through the home list, but you get the idea. My notes say that not all these monopolies were active at one time, but that there were 700 issued in the early decades of the 17th century. And basically, for a huge number of things, you were overpaying so that someone who knew someone who could get the king to take a cut, of which the king would get an itty-bitty fraction. So there you are, resentful of courtiers and overpaying and therefore not buying other things so that the whole country is less prosperous and you don't have your personal needs met. Employment is less, everyone is poorer, fewer people have jobs, and for what? It mostly isn't going to the crown to pay for lavish parties. I mean, a well-prepared navy. It's going into some already rich person's pocket. And you know it, and everyone knows it, but no one does anything about it. It's hard for us to accept the stupidity and criminality of the whole thing. If the crown had imposed an excise tax on all these goods, they could have been as well financed as France. That was how the Dutch financed themselves. It was how the Republic after the Civil War raised huge sums, deliberately copying the Dutch. We know for a fact it worked. But the mafia-like impulse of the Stuarts led them to this monopoly approach that was the worst of all possible worlds. In this narrow slice, you have to say that they were just scum. Criminal, self-defeating, country-harming, supposedly led by a genius. You definitely see a little of Tolkien's evil will oft evil Mars at work here. And the other consequence is like prohibition. There's a hell of a lot of law breaking. Everyone does it. Respect for the law and its majesty suffers. And this is another consequence of ignoring long-run elasticities. Another way to frame fallacy 6. People will adjust behavior significantly, and those adjustments cause other adjustments, and so on, and pretty soon you have utterly unexpected consequences.
I remember you talked about how the Portuguese failed to lower spice prices when they broke the back of the Ottoman-Venetian spice trade by force. Their profits were so great that they attracted the attention of the Dutch, who consequently took it away from them.
Yeah, that's the classic example of underestimating long-run elasticity. And with these, imports and exports were often restricted as to where they could go by a monopolist's right of inspection. So industries were often run mainly for the benefit of the monopolist rather than the customer. So there were often shortages. Often they weren't even business people trying to do a good job. The salt monopolist didn't produce enough salt some years. What did they care? Their profits are obscene already. But the fish industry can't get its needs met, and you can't import salt when they need it. The increased price of potash and alum means that the clothing industry can't be competitive. Oh, well, who cares? We got ours. The increase in the price of coal hit all industries. If a monopoly license were like a tax, and an excise tax or even a sales tax, basically all the benefit after cost of collection, which was about 50% in the 18th century, would go to the government for some sort of public good. But these monopolies were not like that. For most monopolies, the crown got 7.5%. That's all. The monopolist, 92.5%. The soap monopoly enforced a low-quality soap that blistered the washerwomen's hands, and the government got only 2.5%.
That's insane. The monopolists were taking over 90% and doing a bad job. Why didn't Parliament put them out of business?
Well, that's exactly what the monopolists were afraid of and what Parliament frequently did. They often did not expect to keep their monopolies for long, so they better exploit them while they can. And they knew that Parliament was against them and would pass legislation against them over and over. So the monopolists knew they had to squeeze the suckers while the squeezing was good, and that would outrage Parliament even more, and they would therefore be sure to try and end the monopoly, because the king had to assent.
You are describing a vicious cycle.
A vicious cycle.
Much like a man-powered two-wheeled vehicle whose aggressive handling causes a large traffic accident.
And hell, the poor monopolists couldn't even count on the king. The king several times sold the same monopoly twice over. So watch out. It's a get-rich-quick deal. Other government intervention was so bad it echoed down the centuries. The cocaine project, nothing to do with nose candy. This was a weird scheme. It involved 75% of England's total export, so playing games with it was potentially disastrous. It did cause a severe recession or depression. Most English cloth was shipped raw to the United Provinces, where it would be dyed and finished, and then exported again to other places like the Baltic. Cocaine, the guy's name was Cocaine, convinced James that he could bring the whole cloth export industry under royal control by allowing him to dye it before export. So he would be the only person who would color it, and no cloth would be allowed for export undyed. So everything would have to go through Cocaine's hands. And they would finish the cloth and export directly to the Baltic. And most of the profit was in dyeing and finishing, so there was some sort of surface-level plausibility to this stupidity.
Well, Cocaine probably had expertise in finishing cloth, right?
No.
Okay, fine, but, well, at the least he must have had the production facilities to dye all that wool, right? Wow, to think that a deal involving cocaine could go so awry. Why did the king allow him to play with the economy in the first place?
Possibly James did not realize that Cocaine was a schemer. He promised James a 200,000-pound cut, not an industrialist, that he couldn't handle the volume in any way at all. For all his fame at diplomacy, he forgot that the Dutch were human too. They had agency. This was a major threat to them, a major threat to the Dutch, so they retaliated. They forbade the import of any English cloth, raw or finished, and forbade the carrying of any English cloth, raw or finished. So when cocaine finally gave up and was allowed to export unfinished cloth, there was no shipping to carry it and no ready buyers. And there was just a massive amount of unsold cloth. Much of it died so poorly that nobody wanted it. And there was nearly 1,000 bankruptcies. People went out of work left and right. There were riots in many towns, and faced with disaster, the Crown insisted that the weavers keep their employees, and London merchants keep buying cloth that they couldn't sell. Like, right, that's going to happen. This, of course, didn't work either. It's a waste to produce without buyers, and the Crown had to cave. James made an apologetic declaration, which was quite nearly, oops, that didn't work. Let's go back to the old way. It later became a favorite of Marxist analysis in the crisis of overproduction, which in reality is a trivial problem without government intervention like this causing something like a severe recession or even a depression. And with the unhappy result of the cocaine project, let's move on to conversations with Cami. And thank you, Joseph Ardennes. I really appreciate the insight and entertainment you bring to the program. I love having you as a guest.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
All right, Cami, we're having this conversation on New Year's Day. We just heard Joseph Ardennes tell a good cocaine joke.
Yeah, that surprised me.
Yeah, it was a surprise to me too.
but it was great.
It was really good.
It was really good. It was good to hear your spontaneous laughter in there too. It's always fun to hear Joseph Ardennes on the show. I always appreciate him. Okay, I've got to admit, when you kept referring to new, lighter draperies, I was picturing the draperies we hang over our windows, the dark curtains to block out light, decorative fabrics, things like that. I wasn't realizing at the beginning that you were talking about cloth, the cloth industry as a whole.
Yeah, it's funny how sometimes a word for ordinary things, then when used in a technical sense, refer to something completely different.
And I liked when you brought in the example of that wonderful coat that hangs in our closet. It doesn't look old.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
It is, and the quality.
Still looks great.
The reminder of how higher quality, sometimes that invests so long lasting. It makes it worthwhile rather than which kind of went into the whole thing with cocaine that you mentioned. I don't mean the stuff in your nose. Well,
not my nose,
no.
Somebody else's nose.
Which brings me to the whole part of the topic of Mr. Cocaine having that monopoly, one person controlling the dye of all the fabric.
75% of England's exports were woolen stuffs at this time, and he controlled it all.
Wow, I didn't realize
he was the only
one
allowed to dye it and then export it.
And he had no expertise.
I mean, he was a merchant. He was a trader. He wasn't a completely random guy, but yeah, he didn't have the facilities. He didn't have the expertise. When they actually were dyeing, they were doing a terrible job. Nobody wanted to, wear the clothes. It was so bad, basically nobody would pay money for it.
What a waste of good fabric.
Yeah, it wasted the efforts of hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, I was going to say, did he have a large warehouse someplace down by the docks that he was trying to do this dyeing in, or what?
Yeah, there were facilities all over. He was trying to do this on this great big scale, utterly failing at the last part of it. It wasn't just a quality failure. There was also a distribution failure because the Dutch did not like this idea. They were free, independent actors. They responded by saying, no, we're not going to take any of your woolen cloth, and we're not going to allow any of it to be carried on our ships. The Dutch were carrying, something like 90% of the carry trade was Dutch because their customs were so low.
The carry trade was you'd bring products from all over the world to a port like Amsterdam,
and buyers from all over the world would buy, and then the goods would be re-exported. And obviously this could only happen where customs duties are low.
Around this time, in terms of voyages, trading voyages to the Baltic per year, the Dutch were doing about 1,500, the English were doing about 25. So the scale of it was just enormous. The English merchants could not handle it.
So you mentioned the poor being treated better in England.
Yeah, than any place else. I mean, locally they were taken care of. You had this charitable structure that talked about in several episodes. I think we devoted episode 17 to it. But when there were national concerns, basically they weren't treated as if they had any rights. If there was a war, there was going to be conscription. The local JP maybe had to supply 200 men. He would ask, oh, how many do we have in the jail today? And there'd be, we've got 50 in jail. Okay, well, take them. And then a list of any other drunkards and ne'er-do-wells that we don't like and would like to get rid of. You just ship them out.
Don't want to get on the poor side of the person making those decisions.
Right. The JP was basically a dictator of the locality. Only common law could restrain them, and common law was based on custom, and custom was more important than property rights. Custom was often stronger than property rights in common law at that time. So you don't really have a strong basis for capitalism without really good property rights, and that's still developing. Whatever social constraints that there could be on the JP were really important.
Desire of own land by the non-nobles. That seems like a desire that's been passed down along for generations then.
Yeah, it's where status derived from. If you think about, especially on the continent, I mean, in England you could get status for earning money. On the continent, status really only came from land. When European peasants would emigrate to America, that's all they wanted. They wanted land. They wanted to start their own farms. And they often had to work, for a few years to build up enough money to buy land, which, was relatively dirt cheap on a world scale. And you had to have you had to have your tools, you had to be able to do your building materials and all those things before your first crop came in. And that's what people would do. They would work to earn money for that stake. And then as soon as they had enough, they would just quit. And so American wages were the highest in the world by quite a bit, almost like from the beginning of America. And it was mainly because of this demand and supply equation where people were not willing to work for wages. They wanted to have their own land and work for themselves.
And earn that right to a quiet enjoyment of property, which is actually still on the books today as far as people having the right to the quiet enjoyment of their property. You see
you run into
feuds
that in your
about
work
that,
sometimes.
and you see stories about that.
We can have a shorter segment today because this is a really long episode.
Well, the only other thing would be to discuss, I appreciated your pointing out how the Stuarts really restricted and prevented some of the changes that were coming from happening probably more naturally. And they weren't big thinkers. They didn't like change. They were sabotaging the change that was coming in some ways. Slowing it down is what the picture I have in my mind.
Yeah, they got something right accidentally. And we talked about that a little bit last episode with Knight Rider, where the level of taxation at a national level was really low, like 1/12 the level of taxation of the French. That was probably extraordinarily helpful to the English economy, to the people's ability to invest.
You have to imagine a time absolutely starved of investment capital, nothing like today. The combination of success and business of Puritans who do not consume their profits with conspicuous consumption of luxuries and instead keep investing and reinvesting, that was simply unique and world-altering.
And the other thing, of course, was relatively good internal peace. I mean, I highlighted all these examples of unrest, and I like that guy in The Forest of Dean preaching the equality of man. But that low tax base probably created a lot of opportunity for investment. and really probably helped drive England ahead of the rest of Europe at this time. It would really show by about the 1670s. It wasn't really obvious by this time.
So it took a while for this benefit to really become evident, and
it took a long time for a capitalist organization to affect most of the economy or much of the economy.
A whole mindset accepting of change had to happen. The medieval idea, which we're still just barely getting out of, was one for stability. They wanted to keep things the same. The clergy and the nobles and the king, they liked how things were. They wanted to keep it the same. That's the medieval mindset. That's what had to change.
Because even now in the 1620s, there's still lots of medieval era regulation still at work. There's all these restrictions on the kinds of jobs you can have. You can't even start a business. You can't even be your own master legally in all kinds of different trades because of these restrictions. And it's really hard for us to understand how controlled and limited people were.
And land could not be mortgaged or even fully sold in most cases. That has to wait for 1646. And even then, people were not ready for the huge mindset shift that had to occur before land, the big asset, could be capitalized fully, and time defeated.
Was there still a lot of things like if your dad was a shoemaker, you became a shoemaker? Cobbler, actually.
A cobbler or shoemaker, it depended on the locality. And one of the points I was making about Birmingham was that you can start a business making forks, knives and forks, or sword blades, or anything out of metal. And you could do it without having to do a 7-year apprenticeship through a licensed master.
The limit of the number of masters available hugely limited apprentices and the growth of an industry by limiting skilled labor. We can see these regulations as self-crippling today, but at the time it was just custom.
So anyone could go to Birmingham who had the skill and start a business in anything metallurgical. And of course, Birmingham in that area became very quickly the world leader in all those kinds of products. And that just shows that, if there were, wherever the opportunity existed, you had this incredible growth, incredible economic growth, people being lifted up out of poverty. But there were very few places where that kind of opportunity existed.
This is what it means when they say medieval rules gave social stability but maintained poverty. Lift it just a little bit somewhere, and a miracle would occur. And that's reality.
Thanks for coming on the program.
You're welcome.
Quokka's made some really good changes at the website, hangingwithhistory.com. Go check them out. And go ahead and give her your feedback. I'm sure she'd be delighted to hear from you. Please click subscribe or follow on your podcast app. Thank you for listening. Just remember, you can always reach me at harold@hangingwithhistory.com. That's Harold is HARALD at hangingwithhistory.com, or through the contact us link on the website.